Imagine a young man only 25 years old, heir to one of the greatest fortunes of Victorian England. £29,000 in 1885, the equivalent of millions of dollars today. A cricket star, a national celebrity, a guaranteed future in high society. But then, on a cold London morning, this young millionaire made a decision that left his family in shock. The English society utterly perplexed, and that would forever change the course of world missionary history. Charles Thomas Studd was about to do something no one expected, something that few would dare to do even today. He was going to give away his entire inheritance, every penny, for the work of God. But the story doesn't end there, brothers and sisters. What happened after that radical decision created ripples that crossed oceans, transformed entire nations, and still, to this day, impacts lives all around the world. Can you imagine walking away from a fortune just to follow Christ? If that spoke to your heart, drop a comment saying, "Total surrender," and let's discover together how God uses those who dare to fully trust Him. Charles Thomas Studd was born in 1860 into a wealthy and influential English family. His father, Edward Studd, was a former army officer who had amassed a huge fortune through plantations in India. Charles grew up surrounded by privilege, mansions, servants, elegant clothes, and the promise of a bright future. In the eyes of society, he was the kind of young man who'd never have to worry about anything. But what made him even more well-known was sports. As a teenager, Charles rose to fame as one of the best cricket players in all of England. In the newspapers of that era, his name appeared in sports headlines, and crowds would pack the stadiums just to watch him play. For many, that young man was a symbol of success and inspiration. Yet behind the appearance of fame and wealth, there was something no one could see: an empty heart. Charles had talent, money, and admiration, but he lacked meaning. The success of cricket and the privileges of his inheritance couldn't fill the deepest longing of his soul. And this is exactly where God would begin writing a surprising story. Because, as so often happens, the Lord takes what the world sees as great and shows that true worth doesn't lie in fortune or applause, but in a life surrendered to Christ. What Charles didn't know was that a radical turning point was about to happen, one that would change the direction of his life forever. It was at the height of his youth that something unexpected happened. In 1877, Charles's father, Edward Studd, attended an evangelistic meeting led by Dwight L. Moody, the famous American preacher. The simple yet powerful message of the gospel touched his heart, and he was converted. The transformation was so evident that it impacted the entire Studd family. Soon after, an evangelist connected to Moody also preached at the family home. It was there, in that atmosphere of faith, that Charles and his brothers heard the message of salvation clearly. He wasn't a poor or forgotten man. He was a wealthy young heir, a celebrated athlete. But at that moment, he realized something. All the money, all the fame, and all the cricket glory could never guarantee the eternity of his soul. At 18 years old, Charles gave his life to Christ. The impact of that decision was immediate. His passion for cricket no longer carried the same weight, and within him grew a burning flame for something greater. He himself declared years later, "If Jesus Christ is God and died for me, then no sacrifice I could ever make for him can be too great." Brothers and sisters, that's the phrase that summed up his life. A young man who could have followed the path of fame and luxury, but instead chose to let go of it all to follow the Master. But that flame still needed to be tested, because before giving up everything, Charles would face an inner battle: to live for the world or to live fully for Christ. Even after his conversion, Charles Studd didn't immediately walk away from cricket. He kept playing at a high level, cheered on, and recognized in crowded stadiums. To many, he seemed like the perfect example of a successful young man, faith in God combined with athletic achievement. But inside, a struggle grew stronger every single day. On one side, there were the cheers of the crowd, the fame, and the safety of a millionaire's inheritance. On the other, there was Christ's call to a life of total surrender. Charles felt he couldn't serve two masters. He'd either live for himself or live fully for God. That inner battle reached its peak during his years at Cambridge University. While he shone on the cricket fields, his soul burned with restlessness. Friends and family encouraged him to pursue a sports career and enjoy the wealth he'd inherited. But the more he shined before men, the stronger the feeling grew that he was wasting his life before God. Then came the decisive turning point. Charles began connecting with a small group of Christian students at Cambridge, young men who also longed to live radically for Christ. Together, they started dreaming of something unthinkable, taking the gospel to China, one of the most closed and challenging nations for missionaries at that time. The battle between fame and calling was coming to an end. Charles knew he had to choose, remain a sports star or become a servant in the hands of God. And what happened next would change not only his life, but the destiny of 3 whole continents, proving that when God transforms a heart, not even all the world's wealth can stand against his power. By the late 19th century, China was considered one of the most difficult mission fields in the world, a vast land steeped in ancient traditions, hostile to the gospel, and filled with dangers for foreigners. Few dared to risk it. But that was exactly where Charles Studd felt God's call, and he wasn't alone. At Cambridge, 6 other brilliant young men, all from wealthy, influential families with promising careers ahead, decided to join him. They became known as the Cambridge 7. They were respected students with guaranteed futures, yet they chose to lay everything down to follow Christ. When they announced they were going to China, the news spread across the newspapers and shook British society. Many couldn't believe it. How could such talented, wealthy young men throw their lives away in a distant and dangerous country? But brothers and sisters, it was precisely that shock that made their testimony so powerful. Before leaving, the group held farewell gatherings in several English cities. Thousands came to hear them. What drew the crowds wasn't human brilliance, but the fire of conviction burning in their hearts. They showed that Christ was worth far more than fame, fortune, or career. In 1885, they finally set sail for China as missionaries with the China Inland Mission, founded by Hudson Taylor. It was a step of faith with no guarantees, but filled with hope. What they didn't know was that, upon setting foot on Chinese soil, they would face not only cultural and language barriers, but also deep crises that would test their faith to the limit. The arrival of Charles Studd and the Cambridge 7 in China was marked by culture shock and great trials. The country was vast, its customs and languages complex, and it was far from welcoming to foreigners. Within the first few months, they realized that preaching the gospel there would take more than enthusiasm. It required humility, renunciation, and deep dependence on God. Charles, used to the comforts of England, now wore Chinese clothes, ate local food, and struggled to learn the language, a difficult and slow process. He had left behind not only his fortune, but even his cultural identity, all for the sake of winning people's hearts. But missionary life was anything but romantic. Hostility toward foreigners, constant sickness, lack of resources, and long stretches of loneliness marked those years. Charles fell ill several times, facing health crises that nearly made him give up. Yet, in every weakness, he discovered a new level of trust in the Lord. Despite all hardships, the first fruits began to appear. Small groups of Chinese people heard the message of Christ, and some were converted. They were small steps, but proof that the gospel was indeed penetrating one of the most difficult places on earth. One of the most striking accounts from this period was the transformation of his own faith. Once, he had been a celebrated millionaire. Now, he was a dependent servant, often invisible, but finding joy in serving Christ in the smallest of things. Brothers and sisters, it was in this environment of trials that Charles grew spiritually. He learned that God's call isn't measured by immediate results, but by faithful obedience. Yet the trials wouldn't end there. An unexpected message would arrive from England, and once again Charles would have to choose between the safety of an inheritance and radical obedience to the gospel. In the midst of his mission in China, Charles received news that would once again change the course of his life. His family's fortune, his massive inheritance, was finally being handed over to him. In the world's eyes, this meant security, power, and prestige. It was the perfect opportunity to return to England and enjoy a comfortable life. But, brothers and sisters, Charles's heart no longer belonged to this world. He made a decision that shocked even his closest friends. He gave up the entire fortune. Instead of spending it on luxury, he distributed it all in donations to missions, evangelism, and care for the poor. Among the recipients were George Muller, who cared for orphans through faith and prayer, and William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army. Charles believed that wealth wasn't his, but God's, and it had to be invested in the kingdom of heaven. And to make it even clearer that his trust was only in Christ, he set aside a portion of the inheritance for his future wife, Priscilla, as a wedding gift. But when she found out, she refused it, insisting that all of it be given to the Lord's work. The couple began their life with no material wealth, only faith. That decision was a scandal to society at the time. Many called him reckless, accusing him of wasting his life and destroying the family legacy. But that radical surrender not only proved his faith, it opened the way for God to use him across distant continents, in places where the need was even greater. After years of service in China, Charles and his wife Priscilla returned to England for a time, but not to rest. Their eyes and hearts were set on new missionary horizons. First, the Lord led them to India, where Charles served as a pastor in Uttarakhand in the mountains of the south. There, he preached not only to locals, but also to British soldiers who lived far from their families and were easily drawn into sin and addiction. His message was simple, yet piercing. A life without Christ is empty. Many soldiers gave their lives to the Lord through his ministry, proving that the gospel can reach hearts in any context. But God had even greater plans. In 1910, already weakened in health, Charles felt the call to Central Africa, an even more challenging region, marked by hostile tribes, tropical diseases, and unexplored territories. To human eyes, it was madness. But to Charles, it was the opportunity to bring the gospel where almost no one dared to go. He founded the Heart of Africa mission with the goal of reaching people who had never heard the name of Christ. There, he faced extreme conditions, fevers, lack of food, isolation, and constant danger. Still, none of it stopped him. His life proved that the fire of the call was stronger than any physical obstacle. Many of those peoples heard the name of Jesus for the first time through the voice of Charles Studd and his companions. He wasn't seeking applause or recognition, only obedience. But the price of that obedience was high. Charles's health was consumed, and the final years of his life would be marked by pain, yet also by an eternal legacy. The last years of Charles Thomas Studd's life were lived in Africa under extreme conditions. His fragile health became a heavy burden. Malaria, constant pain, and physical exhaustion followed him daily. To many, it was time to stop and rest. But Charles thought differently. As long as he had breath, he would keep proclaiming Christ. In simple huts, lying on makeshift beds, he still preached. Often he couldn't travel long distances, but he would call the natives close and speak to them of God's love. His frail appearance contrasted sharply with the spiritual strength that poured out of his mouth. He was like the Apostle Paul, who said, "When I am weak, then I am strong." During that period, the Heart of Africa mission expanded. Other missionaries, inspired by his courage, joined the work. Entire tribes heard of Christ. By then, Charles's testimony was no longer just that of a foreign preacher, but of a man who had given up everything and identified deeply with the people he served. Even though he was far from his family for long stretches and often suffered from loneliness, he never regretted his choice. On the contrary, he would say that spending his life for Christ was the greatest honor of all. Brothers and sisters, every day he lived in Africa was like a seed planted in barren soil. Many of those seeds would blossom years later into missionary movements that would impact the entire continent. The end of his earthly journey was drawing near, but the impact of his life was only beginning. In 1931, at the age of 70, Charles Thomas Studd finished his race on this earth, but he left behind a trail that can never be erased. From millionaire heir to unlikely missionary, his life stands as living proof that a man's worth isn't found in riches, fame, or human achievements, but in being fully surrendered to Christ. His example inspired thousands in his own generation and continues to inspire today. The movement he began in Africa grew, giving birth to new missions that reached distant regions. His boldness encouraged young people around the world to let go of comfort and throw themselves into the mission field. Brothers and sisters, the life of Charles Studd challenges us. What are we willing to give for Christ? Have we clung too tightly to wealth, to safety, and to human opinions? Or are we ready to say, "Lord, here I am, use me as you will"? Just like him, each of us carries a unique calling. Maybe it's not to cross continents, but it is certainly to live in such a way that Christ is seen in us. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how much we accumulate in this world. What remains is the eternal impact of what we did out of love for God. If this story touched your heart, write in the comments, "Revive us, Lord." And if you haven't seen it yet, make sure to watch the video about another young millionaire who gave it all to follow Christ. The story of William Borden. I'm certain your faith will be strengthened even more.